I'm trying. It was really amazing seeing like people across the world worship God, and like everyone else has said, the Bulgarians were just so hospitable and and nice, and it was just really great to see what God did through us and in us, and how He changed us, and how He can work in the U.S. or all the way across the world.
So I was the last minute addition. Didn't decide that, or didn't have an opportunity to go till basically a couple weeks before we left. So I kind of had a different perspective. I traveled separately from the group, just because of the way the flights worked out and all that. So I actually kind of had a lot of getting ready time by myself, and almost like debriefing time by myself as well. So I really wanted to make sure that I stayed in a support role. And weirdly enough, a squirrel just ran by the door out there, and it caught my attention. A squirrel, and it really, literally a squirrel just ran by. Had to point that out. Regardless, there was my perspective was very much from support. I wanted to be able to drive the vehicles like I did last year, and kind of maybe provide security or something. I don't know, with jujitsu hands. I don't know, but and really just watch them do the stuff that they were called and been preparing to do for months. Two things, and I'll make it as brief as I can. One is that, and I'm sure some of you were aware, in the time they started planning for this trip and the time they went, there was legislation in Bulgaria that almost stopped this trip dead in its tracks. And the fact that they were going to make requirements on those who met under religious auspices, if you will, that they had to have a certain size. And if they didn't have a certain size, they were going to have to shut their doors, which this church in Kozluk would definitely have not met the criteria and would have had to basically shutter their doors. Unfortunately, that law and that bill got rejected at the highest levels and allowed them to continue on. But there were some other rules. For instance, they had to fly a Bulgarian flag out front, and that's not as of a positive thing as our American flag is in our congregations. It's a little more of a sign of, we control you. The government seeks to do that. So our brothers and sisters in Christ are hanging on by a thread at times. And you think, well, that would produce tension and anxiety and maybe carefulness. And there's none of that. There is nothing but pure joy, appreciation for every time they come to worship, every time that they have a chance to serve somebody else, which has already been said many, many, many times. So all that has done is make them appreciate their faith that much more. They are a tiny little flicker of light that's in this world of what we call Eastern Orthodoxy, which is basically the national and regional church that has control over everything. So like Will said, they're basically the Baptist folks there are basically a cult. That's how few they are. That's what they're treated as, and yet they do it with loving hearts and vibrant hearts. The other thing I'll mention is watching them not just do stuff and experience things as a group, but to be active ministers themselves through their testimony time with the church, through visiting the shut-ins. I don't know if anybody's mentioned that. They visited some of the shut-ins for the church. Even though there's a language barrier, they each take an interpreter with them from one of the other kids. They did a prayer walk around the town and praying over different places, and that's no little thing.